If you want to post your name and which organisation you're joining us from in the chat, that'd be really helpful just to see where you're all joining from. And I know there are a few people joining from both the youth and environmental sectors from the sign up list, so that's really great to see. And also a reminder about recording. So this event is being recorded. So if you don't want to be in the recording, feel free to just keep your videos off today. The recording will be shared with everyone who signed up to the event, even if they're not able to make it today. And all of the slides will be shared as well. So you don't need to worry about scribbling down notes. They'll all be shared with everyone after today's event. Great, I think we're going to kick off as we've got quite a jam-packed agenda. So I'm going to do a quick introduction into the Scotland's Young People's Forest project, which this training webinar has been supported by, and also do a bit of an introduction into a definition of what climate justice is before our three incredible speakers will be giving their own input and their own perspectives on climate justice. So we've got ACUS joining us from the Ethnic Minority Environmental Network, Irina from Sniffer, and Cornell from the Environmental Rights Centre for Scotland. So they'll all be inputting for 10 minutes each, and then we'll have some small group discussions around the topic of climate justice, closing up at 4 o'clock. Okay, so we'll start with just a little bit of background to Scotland's Young People's Forest. The vision of this project is to create the first forest in Scotland that's co-designed, governed and led by young people. And the mission of the panel is to create and regenerate native Scottish forests, which are accessible and which help combat the current climate emergency while promoting and connecting education, wildlife and well-being. And this project is driven by a panel of young people who are aged between 11 and 26 years old. And it's supported by YouthLink Scotland and Young Scot, as well as an expert advisory panel of environmental and forestry experts. And this image on screen as well is a prototype that the young people have created to visually depict what they want the forest to look like. And the young people also co-designed the 5 key objectives to shape the project, focusing on regenerating land as sanctuaries for native Scottish wildlife, improving health and well-being, creating forested places that are accessible for everyone, and connecting people to their cultural heritage, while also empowering other young people to take action on issues of climate change and environmental concern. So today's training webinar focuses on objective 3 and 5. And it was really important to the young people that the Scotland's Young People's Forest project can inspire other youth groups and other communities to engage in these objectives, particularly as we continue to search for and secure a site for the forest, which is why we're running these training sessions for the youth work sector. And you can also find out a bit more about the project by following the link in the chat. Okay, so before we hear from our speakers, I just wanted to set the context for what climate justice is for those who might be unfamiliar and new to the term. There are lots of definitions out there, and I know each of our speakers will give their own angle on this and a much more in-depth explanation, but there are just a handful of definitions on the screen here you might want to consider. Ultimately, the climate and nature emergencies are affecting all of us, but this is happening unevenly, leading to inequalities, and it's those who contribute the least to the climate crisis who often suffer the worst effects. So if we look across the globe, it's often those who are vulnerable due to, for example, their location, their gender, their age, their minority status, who are more negatively impacted. And climate justice takes a people-centered approach to climate change, so it's treated as a social, political, and cultural issue as much as it's a scientific and technological one. And it links to human rights, and it means that we need to find solutions to the climate crisis that don't just reduce emissions to protect the natural world, but that also does this in a more fair and just way, creating a more equal world in the process. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'm now going to pass over to our speakers who are the real experts on this topic. And I think all 3 of them are going to be bringing some really interesting perspectives from a range of amazing organizations to get you thinking more about climate justice and how it might be affecting you and your young people and what you might be able to do to engage more with the subject. So our first speaker today is ACUS, who is the Environmental Officer at SEMBO Scotland, which is a national intermediary anti-racism organisation, where she facilitates the Ethnic Minority Environmental Network. And she provides capacity building support to the network members undertaking climate action, supporting the Scottish Government in their endeavour to make the green sector an inclusive space for ethnic minority individuals. She also works on policy influencing and organises community engagement activities to collectively work towards the shared goals of climate justice. So over to you, Akis.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. It's really nice to meet you all today. I'm going to quickly share my screen, and I don't know, can you guys see that?
Yep, we can see that.
Great. I'm quite nervous about staying to time, so I'm going to start as soon as I can. I'm going to talk about climate justice, and this presentation is titled Whether Climate Justice is Just an Idea or an Abstract Movement, or whether it is an ideal that can possibly be met. If you guys were in person, I would talk to you directly, but I'll just explain what this slide is. In this slide, you see a pictorial representation of climate injustices happening right in front of you and around you. In the corner, you can see an illegal child child labor working in an oil mine. You see forestry workers in South India chopping down trees. You can see fishery workers illegally overfishing in Indonesia. And you can see factory farmers in Colombia packaging bananas into plastic packaging. Now, these four industries are a part of the handful of industries in the climate sector that contribute to exacerbating the effects of climate change every single day. But these people who are working on ground in these industries are at the center and at the crux of the problem, but these people in specific are not the problem. These people might seem like they are exacerbating climate change, but this is the real problem. The handful of people and the handful of countries that run the world and have historically and systemically created patterns of imperialism around the world and lived off of the ecological expense of poorer, developing, or lesser developed countries, they are the ones who have created the actual crisis that we're in today, which is called climate change. And this is why the movement around climate justice exists. Because of the few countries and the very few people who historically and presently control the majority of the world. So what is climate justice exactly? And I wanted to talk about a little bit about where the term climate justice in itself comes from. It's quite disputed exactly when the term was coined, but there is one case in specific and one incident in specific that gave rise to lots of movements and protests around climate justice, and it puts into perspective what the issue really is. It was in 1982 in Warren County in North Carolina, where 1,000 tons of PCB-ridden soil was thrown and dumped in a toxic African-American facility. And all the people around it suffered through various cases of neurotoxicity and cancerous impacts of the PCB-ridden soil by inhaling it or being injected by it in so many ways. And 500 protesters who protested against this were arrested and they were never let out. That led to a mass movement around climate justice starting in America, and it wildfired into a globalized movement around climate justice. So climate justice in itself is all about these inequalities and these inequitable situations where people in lower socioeconomic groups are the ones that are mostly and worstly affected by effects of climate change and different environmental risks. I don't know if you all read the news quite often, but currently a lot of people like to talk about something called the current annual emissions, which is how much carbon are different countries emitting into the atmosphere. And a lot of the blame comes on the current big emitters, which are namely India, Brazil, China, and so on. And all of these countries just happen to be in the global south. But these countries did not create the climate crisis as it is today. Currently, there's 1,500 gigatons of carbon emissions stored in the atmosphere. It is scientifically impossible to have gotten to this crisis within the last 40 to 50 years, which is when these countries industrialized and developed enough to cut into their climate budgets. So we got to this situation because of the richer and the more powerful countries that took little steps over a longer period of time by using patterns of imperialism and creating the realities of colonialism that we know that as we know them today. And those countries created the climate crisis, and those countries are the ones that are usually called on to pay for climate justice causes. A research done in 2020 showed that a lot of these richer countries, and there's only 10 of them, finished their climate budgets, which is how much carbon emissions is a country allowed to emit into the atmosphere, by the year of 1990. And those few countries are responsible for 92% of the global carbon emissions. And this is what has caused the climate crisis as we know it now. And this is why the climate crisis is so unjust. And that's why we demand climate justice, which is, very simply put, an idea that asks for just division, fair sharing, and equitable distribution of the burdens of climate change, along with asking everybody to take their fair share of responsibility to deal with the repercussions of climate change. And it may seem like climate injustices are not happening around you, and these are issues happening far away in countries like Colombia and the Philippines, and it doesn't personally affect you. And that's why I wanted to talk just briefly about how it affects you, even sitting here in a developed country, and within Scotland specifically. One main argument for that is that even within richer countries, the economically deprived have lesser climate resilience, and we don't live in an equitable society, and those with lesser means will be the targets of the most climate repercussions. Wanted to give you a few examples so you can understand and put into perspective what different climate injustices look like. It is estimated that 248,000 offices and homes are in danger of flooding in Scotland because of the climate crisis. And this is so unfair because disabled people, homeless people, caring homes, nursing homes, they're the ones which are the least likely to be safely evacuated in the occasion of a flooding. We don't have environmental rights and a proper access to justice. And even if we do, it's prohibitively expensive in Scotland, and has created a system of systemic violence where those that are most vulnerable to environmental damages suffer the most. And probably our colleague at ARCS can elaborate more on that. We know that socially deprived groups and disadvantaged groups in Scotland are constantly exposed to environmental stressors such as air pollution, noise pollution, toxic chemical waste, nature loss, and access to green spaces. And they don't have the resources to adapt and recover, which exacerbates existing health inequalities in the country. And lastly, we know that 80% of Scottish coasts that have been studied have dangerously high concentrations of microplastics that not only damage wildlife, but have serious consequences for human health. Now, these are just a very, very few limited examples of cases that are happening right around you. But this is just to show you and put it into context that if you have a green lens on, and if you have an environmental and a climate lens on, you will be able to realize that different inequalities and different issues around you are deeply inequitable and show what climate justice really is. So I just want to end by again saying that I hope that you're able to understand what the idea and movement around climate justice is. And after this presentation and after this session today, I hope some of you would want to read a little bit more and dig deeper into the movement and try to ask yourself whether the ideal of climate justice can somehow be met someday. Thank you for that.
Thank you, Akis. That was really interesting to sort of walk us through the history of climate justice as well, which I wasn't familiar with at all. So thank you for kicking us off. Unfortunately, we don't have any time for questions for our speakers today, but if you do have any questions, please put them in the chat, and I'm sure our speakers will try and answer them as we go through. So our next speaker is Irina. She works with a sustainability organization called Sniffer on transforming organizations and places to flourish in future climate. And this involves leading climate change adaptation projects with Adaptation Scotland and exploring the role of creative practices in eco-social transformations with creatures. She's currently researching the relationship between land ownership and management and climate action in Scotland, with insights feeding into climate and land policy. And Irina is also writing and making images that explore the human environmental relationships and has been curating Climate Art Labs, which is an art research activism project exploring the meanings and impacts of climate change through art in Ukrainian environments. So yeah, really, really interesting and varied background. I'll pass over to you, Irina.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Naomi, for inviting. And hello, everyone. Good to see so many people joining today's session. And apologies in advance if my voice goes slightly crackly. I'm recovering from a flu, but hopefully I will last. Yeah, I guess I want to just make a couple of points before sharing something that I brought to share today around climate justice. I suppose what Eiko's presentation, that I think, points to so well is about understanding the starting point of climate change in a different way compared to other narratives or stories that explain climate change. So I think that's sort of a lens almost that allows to see more nuance, more complexity, and more politics and depth when we're thinking about what climate change is. And I think, as you've seen in Eiko's presentation, that it helps you look at systems and power dynamics and play that currently are there and that currently causing climate change and environmental harm, rather than focusing on just solutions or kind of things further down the line. And that's really, really important. And another important thing to point out, I guess, is I think climate justice helps see connections between the different movements, feminist, land rights, health, work, labor, all those sort of things. They're not separate from climate justice movement, but kind of, it helps see the overlaps between how the climate action, in a way that is not only about helping reducing the emissions that are causing climate impacts, or just about adapting to the impacts of climate change that are already happening, but also about building fairer and more just society overall. And this issue can seem huge and overwhelming, and oh my God, how do you even deal with it in the day-to-day work and life, especially when we're thinking from Scotland, where there's the ongoing fuel poverty crisis and so many just basic survival struggles that are happening. So it's in that context, it's really, really important to link climate justice and show how it can advance all of those other social justice agendas. So all of these concerns, I suppose, and insights were something that fed into a resource that we have been working on in the past half a year, which is Community Climate Adaptation Roadmap, that I wanted to share with you. As let me just share the screen first. And there we go. Can you see the tree? Yes, excellent. Thank you. So this is a practical guide that we've been developing for communities or community organizations or community-facing groups to adapt to climate change in a way that is grounded in understanding of what climate justice is and how to practice it. And maybe before I introduce it properly, just a few words on sort of why adaptation. So I guess that's another side to the story of climate change, where of course reducing our emissions is an absolute priority and needs to be done very soon. It needs to be treated as if it was a real emergency, which it is. But we are currently in a situation where even if all emissions were stopped overnight, we have already locked in the changes into the systems that we are stuck with for the next 10, 20, 100 years to come, unfortunately. So this isn't about being negative or hopeless, but just facing a reality where those changes are already happening. And with the example again from Eiko's presentation about the flooding, that we see those consequences already taking place across Scotland and all over the world. So this was, a resource, this climate adaptation roadmap that we've been working together with Development Trust Association Scotland, SCAN, Scottish Climate Communities Action Network, and the two climate hubs, NESCAN and Highland and Island Climate Hubs. Where we try to kind of break down thinking about what meaningful climate action can look like locally, what can be a systemic way to tackle it. And when we say route map, it's not sort of this A to Z, here's do these 10 things and climate justice or adaptation will be sorted. Unfortunately, that's not possible or desirable having that sort of thinking about it, because adaptation and climate justice would mean very different things for different places. So this is more designed to help people think about what that would mean in their particular context. So it's an interactive PDF where there's a poster that I will come back to in a moment, but I'll just talk us through the structure quickly first. I think it would be easier to come back to this tree first. So the roadmap is it's built around three stages. I'll just talk through them one by one. So the getting started one is just a very simple one where there's a few different links and resources to point community groups, organizations to where to find support, kind of how to understand what networks already might be there, because one of the key big things in any movement, climate justice is not an exception, is doing things with other people and finding networks or creating those to organize together. So kind of lots of pointers to where to find those or how to create one if something like that does not exist in the area just yet. Then the second stage is understanding climate change in your community, which is kind of in some places in Scotland already have some degree of understanding of that, some not, but that kind of is the importance of understanding how exactly this, what can seem as big abstract thing happening elsewhere, what exactly it means for Edinburgh or Glasgow or whatever specific place you're based in Scotland. And there is different there's a few different sections that are meant to help understanding exactly what those impacts are, starting from outlining what are these bigger trends that we are likely to see in the next few years, that we're seeing already and that will be getting stronger, like rising temperatures, warmer, wetter winters, drier and hotter summers. And the way that we summarize this here are very much built around ideas of climate justice, because again, as Akos was talking about, the way that you experience climate change depends on so many different things. It depends on the geography of where you're based, on the history of the place, on the social, political, economic, and cultural factors. So this is something that in the climate world is often referred to as intersectional experiences of climate change, which means that all of those elements of a person's identity or group's identity play a role in how they're able to cope with the impacts of climate change. And I think the flooding is a very good example of that. It's kind of one of the biggest and most severe impacts that is felt by so many people in Scotland, where, for example, if your house is built on a floodplain, which means it's likely to be flooded, then you are likely to face higher costs for maintaining your home or for recovering from flooding, and kind of knowing who in your community is vulnerable to flooding, where those people are, if they know about this, that kind of all plays a really huge role in kind of how climate justice then plays out in the particular places. Or another example here can be with something I think a lot of people could relate to in Scotland, with the mold being a huge health hazard in many homes, and without proper maintenance and warmer and wetter winters, it can become much bigger issues for people that are already affected by it. So we see here how climate change acts as the kind of something that exacerbates the health issues that are already happening, and could make it worse if they become unaddressed, or if they remain unaddressed, is maybe a more fair way to put that. But yeah, so there's other resources here or pointers to how to then open up a conversation about climate change locally, because it isn't sort of just about learning what is there provided by kind of the scientific knowledge produced elsewhere, but there are a lot of ways how you can get the people that you're working with, or the groups and the communities, to co-create that knowledge of climate impacts together. And that's the lived experiences of climate change, and gathering those is hugely important because they are often not accounted for by the way that the kind of large data sets produced. And that's another important element of climate justice, also of ensuring the lived experiences are part of this kind of shared knowledge of what climate change means and who is affected by it. There's different methods like participatory mapping approaches that we've done in different places in Scotland that I can share 2 links with before, because mapping is a very good technique of kind of actually taking a map and being like, okay, who gets flooded where? If there's heat waves happening, do we know who is likely to be affected by those mostly? There's also different tools that can be used as like a fun and playful ways to explore what climate change means for people in individual levels, which is climate change adaptation personas. If I had a bit more time, I could go into it, but I think I'll just mention it and then put a link into the chat. But that's a way of coming from design thinking and thinking with creating specific generic personas that represent specific, not specific people, but kind of an individual who can be affected by climate change, and then thinking what that would mean for them. So that's, can talk about that more or answer questions about that later. There's also pointers to actually specifically understanding who and what needs to be protected, and a structure for collecting that information and then turning that into an action plan or whatever makes most sense for the groups that you're working with. And the third section, which is kind of the main one, is about taking action, where we have 20-something different actions that can be taken by different groups for different scale, from kind of a smaller, more volunteer-run groups to a bigger development trusts that are more resourced and have paid staff and more resources, or land buildings perhaps that they manage. And these actions are structured around 5 different themes: so regenerate nature, improving housing and neighborhoods, supporting self-sufficiency, getting around and growing skills and employment, which was exactly the reason for thinking about climate adaptation actions through these themes and connecting them to the ongoing issues that people are already working with or dealing with is so important, rather than kind of doing adaptation action of its own. So there's lots of examples of how it connects to the existing themes that we all kind of connect to or care about. And another way to read it also is through the short and longer term action. So kind of if you're looking for what can we do now and without so much time or money, or what can be a more longer term that would require more resources or more collaboration or more partners involved. And each of the actions are also marked with specific kinds of hazards, so whether it's flooding or heat risk or coastal erosion. So you kind of also can see by location what are most relevant for you. I'm just going to scroll through this to give you a sense of how this is looking. So this is, each theme has each of these actions, each of them has links to more resources that you can, click through and find organizations that can support you in carrying out those actions. We've worked with amazing designers, Savannah Visit, to produce this, and I, quite excited about how this is looking. Just maybe a final point to make, that there is no one quick next step in here that would suit everyone. And I think the idea behind this roadmap was just to kind of have it be there as a pointer, a guide that you can remix, make different paths through yourself, and set off on your own path through it. And there's many other organizations, groups across Scotland working on climate and social issues, and there are so many organizations that can support you. And I think remembering that you're not alone in this is hugely important, because burnout is a huge issue in the climate movement, and the climate justice movement, and all the social justice movement. I'm sure, not bringing any big news to you. But hopefully this is something that can be helpful to start up conversations, and also a way of building solidarities across other movements beyond administrative borders or themes, those things. So just a final point to say, I guess, is that we have not had a proper launch of it yet, which will be in 2 weeks' time or so. We don't have a date for it, but I will be able to share this properly then. I think that's all for me. I'm not sure how I'm doing on time. Hopefully I didn't overrun too much. But
thank you so much, Irina. That was amazing. Thank you so much. And we've already had comments in the chat asking if the resource is going to be available. So I'll make sure that it's sent round to everyone once it's been officially launched, along with all the slides and the recording. But that looks like an incredible resource for the youth work sector to be using with young people and youth groups. There's so much packed in there. So yeah, really excited to have that when it's launched. So our third and final speaker today is Cornell, who is an environmental scientist with wide-ranging experience in environmental rights, policy, and community engagement. And he currently works as the rights officer at Environmental Rights Centre for Scotland, leading the awareness and outreach programme and supporting people facing environmental and climate injustice, with a particular focus on marginalised communities and places of deprivation. So I'll hand over to you, Cornell.
Thank you. So I'll crack on because we are so short of time. But what I'm going to do is basically mostly talk about, it's all seen, yeah, mostly talk about what environmental human rights are and how that links into climate justice, and then also talk about how you can use that eventually. Well, I say eventually because we don't, as Aka said, we don't have these rights yet, to fight off environmental injustice and climate injustices. But what is really the difference between it is we're facing, so there's the climate emergency, we're also facing a biodiversity crisis, and there's also a pollution crisis. So there's these three crises that are happening at the same time. They're all interlinked. And depending on what issue environmentally or climate you're looking at, really, it can be an environmental justice issue, it can be a climate issue, all depends on the way that you're framing it. So one example is, so what environmental justice really is the equal distribution of the burdens and the benefits of the environment. So benefits are like being in nature, getting all that mental health well-being. Burdens are anything from air pollution, water pollution, you name it. But one example of that is water pollution in rivers and coasts. So that is seen as an environmental injustice, especially if it's occurring to one location where people don't have the opportunity to enjoy their local river or the coastline where they're able to swim, able to use it for whatever sources like fishing, economically benefiting from that because there is pollution in there. Now that's seen as an environmental justice issue, but it can also be seen as a climate justice issue because what's going into the water, what's affecting the water is also affecting the marine life, which is then reducing the capacity for that marine life to be absorbing carbon into the water. And that's affecting the whole climate, which is affecting people far, far away from where it's actually, where this pollution is actually happening. For example, it is happening in Scotland. So depending on how you look at it, how you frame it, it can be either or. So why do we need environmental rights in the first place? Why do we want to be able to have them to fight problems of environmental justice in Scotland specifically? So there's a lot of talk about, climate justice is very global thing, but with environmental issues and environmental justice, it can be much more localized to your immediate area. And today I'm going to talk about just Scotland specifically. So the substantive, which are like the real issues in Scotland in terms of environmental problems, first around your located around places. So again, air, water, and noise pollution situated around places in Scotland. There are constant issues. There's water pollution in terms of, you name it, chemicals going into the water, raw sewage going into the water, all these industrial processes. It's affecting ecology. Air pollution is also another thing with all the lots of transport causing a lot of pollution within city centres, noise pollution, et cetera, et cetera. We've also got a massive issue with proximity to derelict land. I was talking to someone earlier last week, and they mentioned that 9% of Glasgow is derelict land. And Glasgow is not even the place of most derelict land. So there are places in Scotland that has it's more vacant and derelict land within their cities. Environmental quality, so places like parks and green spaces are reducing in quality because there's less spending on street cleaning, road services, environmental health, keeping these green spaces management. So all the green spaces around Scotland in general are on a decline. And that means their access to green space and nature and all the benefits that come from it are declining with it. Instead of, we know in lockdown how important they are and how important they are for people's mental health and well-being. And so to see that as a decline is a real issue. And again, all these things will end up affecting people's physical and mental health and their well-being. So this is the issues around people in terms of environment problems. So all these issues on the left in terms of places, they affect people differently. Both Akis and Arena said this, children, older people, people with health problems are more susceptible, more vulnerable to these issues. People who are healthy might be completely fine. It might be an inconvenience, but this is can be real life or death situations for these people. It becomes much more worse for marginalized groups. Now, this comes into a whole justice sphere for things. People coming from marginalized areas are usually, and also, not that one, dealing with other issues, social issues, issues of deprivation, and are less equipped to deal with these environmental problems. So when they're faced with it, it's just problem on top of problem on top of problem, and it really feeds into this issue of environmental justice on top of social justice on top of climate justice. And then you've got people in areas that are more vulnerable to severe weather events. Akis said about all the places that are much more vulnerable to flooding, and that's the real issue really in Scotland. And then there's issues of heat waves. So this is what we call distributional environmental injustice. What's happening on the ground and what's affecting people is not equal in terms of places and people. It's very unequal, and that's what's creates this inequality. So if there is an issue in terms of some environmental issue, you think you can remedy that through public bodies. You can say, this is not right, you should be doing it right. If they're not doing it, you should be able to take them to court. You should be able to access the decision-making. You can hold the public bodies to account. That's the ideal world. Unfortunately, in Scotland and the UK, it's not like that at the moment. Like I said, marginalized groups, people who are living in poverty are already dealing with too many things. To be able to spend the time and money to speak up for their rights is just another issue on the current issues that they're facing. These people at the same time will have less willingness to participate in local decision-making, whether that be because of time or trust. And then in the end, they become less aware of their rights. So when their rights are infringed upon, they are less likely to fight against them because they're preoccupied. And then the last issue is, if you get through all those steps, you say, yes, I'm involved. I'm going to be involved in the decision-making. I am aware of my rights. I'm going to take this to court. I'm going to have this access to justice, which just means basically fighting for your rights. When you do get to that point, it is basically ridiculously expensive, and you cannot really, realistically, any individual, unless you're loaded with money, do that. So what does that end up doing is it means there's poor enforcement of the planning and nature conservation laws around Scotland, and then there's no credible threat of legal challenge. And then it just furthers this environment and nature destruction around, and then leads to this climate emergency. So it really is linked, to this climate justice issue. And that's what we call procedural environmental injustice. So these are just all the issues that are in Scotland, but the climate in the policy climate in Scotland is changing. There is a human rights bill that is coming into Scotland. It's being consulted on, and part of that is the human right to a healthy environment. This is very new for Scotland, and this is very new for the world. Is that in 70 years, this is the first new human right that was introduced into the UN, and the Scottish government is putting it in. So these are the substantive rights that will be part of it: clean air, safe climate, access to safe water and sanitation, healthy, safe, sustainable food, non-toxic environments, healthy biodiversity ecosystems. They're not part of law yet, but we're trying to get them to be part of law at the highest standard. And if those are infringed upon, you should be able to access information freely, be able to participate publicly into policies, and you should be able to access justice without having to face those massive costs. So that is coming into Scotland, and that's why you should be just aware of it now, because once those rights do come in, you will be able to fight for issues and all those issues that I mentioned before. And they're not divisible from other human rights. They really link into all these other human rights here. I won't speak about them, but children's right and to the environment, around having the inherent right to life, enjoying the highest standards of health available. those are all linked to these things. So that's an important thing to mention. Now, I'm going to just talk about some examples of issues. So in Scotland, air pollution is a massive one. Air pollution is linked to over 1,700 premature deaths a year in Scotland. And that is usually occurring to those younger, older, and those with existing health problems. It's linked to all these different types of issues: diabetes, obesity, inflammation, cancer, respiratory health. And a real example of this was in London a couple of years back in 2013. The death of a 9-year-old was linked and deliberately linked to air pollution. This was the first time that this ever happened to the UK. So they said that air pollution was the cause of her death. So this is a very real thing. One final example is St. Fiddick's Park. This is an environmental justice issue that lots of people are involved in. So St. Fiddick's Park is an area in Aberdeen, quite a poor area that has been facing issue after issue. So at first they were a fishing area in Aberdeen. They got moved because the oil companies came in. A lot of them were forcibly removed. Then they were faced with, because they were a poor area, they thought this is a sacrifice zone, so we can put our landfills here. They put incinerators there, they put other industries there, and then just got further and further into deprivation. And finally, now that this just transition is coming along, they think we need to put this industry somewhere. Where can we do it? They're going to put it in the last good quality green space that these places has. So it's a lot of flats, a lot of tenement buildings in an area of high deprivation, and they're facing this. They're fighting against the last development of basically their green space, which is high in biodiversity. It's really good for climate, but it's a whole issue in terms of just transition. So this is one of the cases that we tend to we give advice on, legal advice. So when that does happen, what can you do? I'll skip over this. So we have an advice service that gives advice to people legally. And if you're just questioning about environmental justice, or if there's an issue, or you're working with people who have issues, from something very large to very small, we can just have a chat about that and give advice. That's it.
Great, thank you so much, Cornell. It's really interesting to see some of those tangible sort of real life examples happening across Scotland as well, and just sort of bringing things to life a little bit for the group.